Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting gentleman to introduce you tonight, and hopefully we're going to be a little bit more optimistic after the conversation that we have with Bill Burke, who founded the Optimism Institute in 2022 after an extensive media and sports career as an executive writer, producer. Bill served as the CEO of the Weather Channel companies after several years at Time Warner, Turner Broadcasting System, where he was the founding general manager of Turner Classic Movies before going on to become the president of TBS Superstation. And for 15 years, he was the co-owner and chairman of the Portland Sea Dogs, the Double-A minor league baseball affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. And he's got more that we'll talk about later. But let's come back to why you wanted to launch the Optimism Institute. Why, Bill?
Well, I developed a concern that around the world, people are getting obsessed with bad news, with doom scrolling online. And I get a concern that there's a downward spiral when we start doing that. And when we really step back and look at it, there's so many positive things going on in the world, and that long-term trends are pointing in the right direction. And I felt like we need more voices out there talking about this. So we all know that news can be too negative, and if it bleeds, it leads, and that sort of thing. And I thought, rather than curse the darkness, I'd light a candle. And given my background in media and storytelling and writing, I thought that this would be a nice fit for me, where I could work on this issue, but through media platforms like podcasting and social media and that sort of thing.
Why? What do you want to accomplish?
Well, I hope to put a little dent in the world in terms of improving people's outlook and starting ripple effects where people realize that things are better than they thought, and that they won't just inevitably continue to get better, but we all have to avoid getting to a point of despair so that we will keep taking action. So, for example, I've profiled people who are working on climate change. One who's been working on it since he was in 6th grade, and I think he's in his 60s now. He said he's never been more optimistic because, if nothing else, people are realizing it's an issue and there's actual money and effort going towards it. And that if you spiral down into despair around something like climate change, you'll just curl into a ball and think the world's going to end in 30 years and keep driving a big SUV and just hope for the best, as opposed to realizing there are ways to get around this. There are solutions, and get out and vote and protest and try to make a difference.
So you're not just optimism like The Secret, which is just, be happy. It's optimism with people that are actually making a positive change and are optimistic about how their positive change can have a positive impact. Is that true?
Yes, and I'm glad you made that distinction. I've come to dislike the example. People often say, you're an optimist if you think the glass is half full, and you're a pessimist if you think the glass is half empty. To me, that's more sort of just a positivity outlook or positive outlook. Rather, I'd say optimists would see the glass, half full, and they enjoy the rest of it and then go fill it up so they can have some more. Right? You take action to make a good situation better. It doesn't just happen. I gave a talk. I was lucky enough to give a talk to some high school graduates last summer. And I talked to them about, yes, our generation has left them with a lot of problems, but welcome to the club. My grandfather fought in World War I, and that was caused by his parents' generation, and my uncle in World War II, my dad in Korea. And when I was in high school, yeah, we might have whiffed on addressing climate change. Absolutely, my generation did. But when I was graduating, it was acid rain and the ozone layer, and we had apartheid and the Berlin Wall and AIDS and all these things that thankfully have been resolved, frankly, just about every single one of them. And it didn't just happen. These things changed because people voted, and business leaders let in, and politicians took charge, and scientists got to work. And that's why the world's in a better place than it was when I was graduating. And I think it's hard for young people to realize that and have a sense of history and understand that things are better. If you had to pick one time in world history to be alive, you'd probably pick today.
You had an interesting line when we chatted earlier about the comparison between news and history. Can you repeat that line?
It's one of my favorite lines. Kevin Kelly, who is one of the founding editor of Wired magazine, he's a futurist. He's written a terrific book, several great books. And I had him on the podcast, and he said, if you only read the news, you'll think that things have never been worse. But if you read history, you'll realize things have never been better. And I'm a history buff. I was a history major. And when I hear things like in our country, America's never been more divided politically, and I think, we fought a civil war. We had Congress people being bludgeoned on the floor of Congress, the caning of Sumner. I mean, we've been divided. We've always been divided, and it's been particularly unpleasant of late. But a lot of that's because it's so in our face now, and social media and the news is just pounding away at us. So I'm trying to create an alternative to some of that, and help people clean up their social media feeds and spend 45 minutes or so listening to a weekly podcast that'll make them feel better about the world.
Tell us about your podcast. How do we get it?
So it's available wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Blue Sky. So if you go onto the optimisminstitute.com website, you can find it, but it's on Spotify, Apple, all those places, Blue Sky Podcast. And it comes out every Wednesday. So I've got a new episode out tomorrow. And I've talked to people. I try to find people who are either thinking about these things, psychologists and news critics and that sort of thing, but also people actively working on addressing social and climate and environmental problems. So I've talked to people working on climate change who talk about these many solutions that we're developing and that we're finally getting government attention and people are finally realizing this is a real problem, to a guy who has written a book about second chance hiring, which is taking people who are coming out of prison in the United States. If you get out of prison, you're a felon, you apply for a job, you check the box that said you were a felon, you're likely not to get the job. What this guy's doing is he's finding the right people who are eager to find work when they get out of jail, and he's placing them in companies, and they get well trained and they become incredibly loyal employees, and they don't go back to jail, versus people who come out and can't get a job. They're back on the streets. They do whatever crime they did before, and before you know it, they're back in jail. So I'm talking to people who are working on tough stuff, but with a sense of hope and optimism. And the feedback I get from people is when they listen to it, they think a lot and they actually feel a little bit better about things when I'm done. And that's really what I'm trying to do.
The Blue Sky Podcast. Sounds great.
Yes, sir.
We're going to take,
and I named that because there's a meditation prompt which tells you to realize that there is always blue sky above, but sometimes you have to get your head above the clouds to see it. And I find that very helpful. That there's always a good story in there somewhere, and there's always, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, was big in the U.S. I don't know if he was ever big in Canada.
Oh, for sure.
But yeah, so he said, your listeners have probably heard this, but when he was little and he'd watch something scary on the news, he'd look to his mom, and his mom would say, always look for the helpers. In a situation like this, always look for the people who are going in and trying to help. And that's one of the ways I try to think about the world, is when we see these awful disasters and terrible things happening, look at the incredible human response in the aftermath of those events.
Blue Sky Podcast. Sounds great. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Bill Burke in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Interesting conversation about that. We're actually in a pretty good place today. Sounds good. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Bill Burke. He founded something called the Optimism Institute in 2022, and he's got a weekly podcast that he issues called the Blue Sky Podcast. That's an interview with a bunch of different people that have got positive outlooks on life and are doing positive things to try to change our world for the better. Bill, you co-authored Ted Turner's top 10 New York Times best-selling autobiography, Call Me Ted. And later you co-wrote, produced, directed Live Another Day, an award-winning feature-length documentary on the bailout of the U.S. auto industry. I understand that you've interviewed and written about numerous other people. What a great experience you've got. Have you learned anything from those processes of spending time with Ted Turner and being at the top of the media entertainment business?
I've learned a ton, and I was very fortunate. My first job out of business school was working at Turner Broadcasting in the early 90s. And back then, the cable television industry was booming, and Ted was the ultimate entrepreneur, and it was kind of the Wild West. And I was working on new business development, and it sort of fell in my lap. It wasn't my idea, but I was asked to develop a business plan for a channel that would use the classic movie library that Ted had acquired. And before I knew it, I was running Turner Classic Movies and later TBS. So I got to know Ted. He was always my boss's boss. And I learned a lot of leadership lessons from him. And I wrote, after I left the company, I wrote an article, about a 25-page article of leadership lessons I learned from him. And when he saw it, I don't even think he read the whole thing. I'd email it to his secretary, and I got him. He called me and he said, "What are you doing? You got a job?" I said, "Well, I'm working on this." He said, "Listen, I want to do my biography and I want you to write it." I said, "Ted, that article's 25 pages, the longest thing I've ever written." He said, "Yeah, but you'd be perfect." So all of a sudden I was writing a book that had a big advance, and I knew it was going to sell because it was about Ted. And it was a fascinating experience. I learned a ton about research. I learned a ton about how to get the most out of an interview with people, trying to come up with questions they've never answered. And what was fun about it is, in addition to spending this time with Ted, and often in his beautiful properties in Montana and Argentina, I interviewed all these interesting and sometimes very famous people who were quite close to Ted because of his various adventures. So from President Jimmy Carter to baseball's Hank Aaron to, of course, James Fonda, his longtime wife, all Tom Brokaw, really interesting people. And so I think from that, I learned a lot about researching for an interview, thinking about what makes the person tick. And it sounds kind of trite, but when you meet these people who are household names, you do realize they're just people, and they're often quite unusual. I mean, Ted, I heard him say to his girlfriend one time, normal people don't change the world. And, some of these people truly are very different and from a different mold, but they all have their weaknesses. They all have their insecurities. And it's kind of interesting to see that up close. I was fortunate enough to meet with Bill Gates in his office, and, he's got kind of an interesting body tick sometimes when he talks that I found very interesting and different. And, but he has great affection for Ted. And so you see people talking about their friends and their vacation lives and that sort of thing. You realize that they're all just people. And I found that very interesting. And I also developed no fear when it comes to reaching out and asking people if they'll sit down and talk with me. I know you have to do a lot of that, Brian, and what you do. And you realize, what, it's some people might not answer your call, but it's worth a try. And then once you get a chance to talk to them, it's just fascinating to learn what makes people tick and what's on their mind.
You've had really quite the fascinating career. You graduated from Harvard Business School. You were the general manager of Turner Classic Movies, the president of Turner Broadcasting System, Superstation, president and CEO of the Resort Sports Network, president and CEO of the Weather Channel companies, co-author of Call Me Ted, co-founder of Argo Pictures, member of the board of directors of Simul Media, Inc., member of the board of directors of Dead River Company, chairman of Portland Sea Dogs, and now the founder of the Optimism Institute. With all those experiences and meeting all those fascinating people that you just mentioned, why do you want to do a podcast and try to inspire people to be more optimistic? What's in it
there's
for you?
A lot of reasons.
What's in it for you?
Oh, there's nothing particularly in it for me. There's not a pot of gold at the end of this particular rainbow. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I'm making a difference. I think it leverages some of the skills that I haven't always used. When you're an executive, I used to read scripts and I'd have some input into the creative process, but I found over time from writing the book and making the documentary, spent a lot of time right across the river in Detroit, by the way. I just found that I love storytelling. So there's that in it for me. And I feel like I'm doing something good with my time and helping people. I get great feedback from folks, and wow, how'd you find that person? That was really interesting. Gee, I never thought of it that way. Maybe things aren't so bad. And, because of this work I'm doing, I had the chance to speak to some high school students, and I felt like I left a bunch of 18-year-olds hopefully feeling better about the world as they headed off into it. And so if I can make those little differences, that makes me feel great. And I'm having a lot of fun doing it. And I'm my own boss. I've done some entrepreneurial things, but for the most part, like most people, I've always had a boss or a board, or and this is all me. The name, the Optimism Institute, was available. It's somewhat tongue in cheek because you're talking to the only member of the Institute. This is just my thing right now. I have some graphic help and some sound help and that sort of thing, but I'm it. And that's a lot of fun. That's a rare opportunity to do something like this.
You said you were motivated to get into this when you were at something called the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard. Tell me a little bit about that experience, if you could.
Yeah, it was an incredible experience. My wife joined me as a partner. I was a fellow. It's called ALI, Advanced Leadership Initiative. It's a one-year program for people sort of later in their careers with leadership experience who are looking to find ways to create social impact ventures or work with people, social entrepreneurs and that sort of thing. And so you go as a cohort. There are about 45 of us from all over the world. There was a guy from Toronto, and there were, the former vice president of Panama was there. She was terrific. The former police chief in Dallas, a sportscaster. There were all kinds of different people. And we had a core curriculum where we learned about challenges around the world and how we might address them. And then you could audit classes all over the Harvard campus. And so we had a 3-day discussion with a bunch of professors and presentations about global mental health. And it was there when I realized that this was a real issue, that people were getting too pessimistic and too anxious about the future of the world. And I loved the 3 days, in part, I realized, because the guy who put it all together, Dr. Vikram Patel, was such an incredibly optimistic and positive person. So here we were talking about these terrible challenges of mental health, but being taught it by a guy who could point to a pathway where we might make it better. And we all left there actually feeling good about things. I thought to myself over that summer, this is really what I need to do. As to talk about optimism and how much the world is improving and how much we can all do to keep that happening. So that's really how it came about. It was a fantastic program. It was a year where I met incredible people. It's great for my wife and me. We were back in a college town. We were college sweethearts, so that was fun. The whole thing was terrific, and I have a big thank you to Harvard for creating the opportunity.
Sounds like an incredible experience, and to share it with someone important and special to you would have been really wonderful. You quoted Mark Twain on your LinkedIn post. I am an old man and have known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened.
I love the quote. I mean, Mark Twain, and you always have to verify these. There's about 4 or 5 people who get misattributed: Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill, Mark Twain. But Mark Twain did say that, and that, to me, is a great witty way to talk about worry. We can sit around and come up with every awful scenario about what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, in 5 years. The world is going to end from climate change in 30 years. And we rarely go back and double check. And Mark Twain there is saying that most of the things, that the troubles, as he described them, they just never happen. And that's something that I think is really important. We can stew and we can worry. And the algorithms on social media continue to feed us things that tend to bring us down and often separate us into camps. And so eliminating that worry is a great step towards having a more optimistic outlook. And in classic Twain fashion, he summed it up very well.
You did a podcast with a gentleman that was a Wall Street executive turned addiction recovery advocate.
Yes.
Talked about him as Stephen D. And he tells the story, or you told the story of being a father and a family coming together to save one of their own from a life-threatening addiction. And he shared his story and some resources. Tell me a little bit about that conversation, if you could.
It was powerful. So Steve, actually, a few years before me, he went through this same Harvard program, and he was there to learn as much as he could about addiction recovery. So this was a man who had, as he described it, he was living the dream. He was working at Morgan Stanley. He was a senior executive. He had 4 children. 3 were pretty much launched. The third, one was a senior in high school. And the 16-year-old, they knew was drinking and getting into some trouble, but one night came home, barely made any sense. And it turns out he lay down on train tracks to try to kill himself. And it was only because a friend of his happened to be walking by and pulled him off that he was still alive. So in that moment, as he describes it was on a Saturday night. They were watching Saturday Night Live. His world was turned upside down. He left his job. He did everything he could to save his son, literally save his son. And he tells the story beautifully. And through his year at Harvard and some of the other work he's done, that's his entire calling now, is to help other people and families work on problems of addiction. So for me, it was the perfect kind of story to feature on my podcast, because it is about as tough an issue as you can discuss, especially the hardships of a child. If anyone is a parent, it really tugged at your heartstrings. But to see how this family came together, and now that son, I think we're 10 years on now, or maybe even 12, he now works in addiction recovery. He's a hero for people that he works with. And so it comes out with this positive ending, but after a really deep, tough struggle. So it was a very profound conversation. His website, by the way, is addictionlessons.com, and he tells his story very openly. We didn't use his last name on the podcast just for anonymity, but he talks about their challenges very openly, and we'll talk to any family who is facing a serious or similar issue. So it was a perfect topic for me and the perfect guest, and he was terrific.
So, I've interviewed people about addiction, and a lot of the answers are rehab and things like that. I wouldn't have associated with optimism. So how did you turn it into being relevant to your Optimism podcast?
Well, part of it was to tell one of those stories that has a happy ending. That was part of it. And also to remind people that it's never an easy or straight path. We're all going to have hardships, and they just about bottomed out as a family before things got better. So part of what I like to talk about, I also interviewed a guy who was sentenced to 16 years for manslaughter when he was 20 years old. His girlfriend was sexually assaulted. They knew who did it. He got in a fight with the guy and he killed him. And this guy winds up in jail at the age of 20. And somehow, through the encouragement of his dad, he completed his college degree from jail. He started a college accreditation program for fellow prisoners. And he now runs a major international nonprofit after spending 12 years. He got a reduced sentence in Sing Sing prison. So these stories of resilience, I think one of the reasons people have a tough time being optimistic is because life is tough and we all get dealt really tough hands. But I think to tell these stories about how people hang in there, stay positive, stay active. My friend who had this problem with his son with addiction, he didn't head for the hills or give up or, lock his kid away. He worked at it. And he and his wife worked at it. It was tearing their marriage apart. The siblings came home from school to help out. And so I find those to be encouraging and uplifting and optimistic. This one happened to have a very happy ending. Sometimes these things don't. We all know that. But it's a really uplifting story. And those are the kinds that I want to tell.
Addictionlessons.com is the website?
Yes. Addictionlessons.com. It's fantastic.
Addictionlessons.com. And
Yes.
Your website is the Optimism Institute.com.
Yes, sir.
And your blog, your
podcast is Blue Sky, and it's everywhere. Spotify, Apple. It's on YouTube. I don't release video, but you can listen to it on YouTube if that's your preferred platform. It's anywhere you listen to podcasts.
You have another interesting quote here. You interviewed a young lady from Mumbai, India, and you say that she was encouraged at the end of every day to ask herself, how many people have I made smile and how many people have I helped today? That's a great way to think about your day.
She was fantastic. Jeru Billamoria. And again, I'm smiling now because one of the fun things about this project is I never would have met Jeru Billamoria if I weren't doing this work, but someone recommended I speak to her and I tracked her down. And yeah, she was raised in India by two remarkable parents. And she told a beautiful story because her father died fairly young. And it wasn't until he passed and the tributes after he died that she realized how much he did for other people. He was a professional by training. I can't remember. I think he might have been a lawyer. Might have that wrong. But little did she know that he was helping people throughout their village. And it wasn't until he passed that he found that out. And that was the mindset that she learned from her parents. And literally, and she does it to this day, before she goes to bed, she thinks about how many people she helped. My friend who has a son dealing with addiction says he had all these metrics when he was at Morgan Stanley. And his metric now is, how much time did I spend this week helping other people with addiction? Very similar metric.
You quote Bruce Springsteen on your your social media. All people have is hope, says Bruce. That's what brings the next day and whatever that day may bring. A hope grounded in the real world of living, friendship, work, family. Bruce Springsteen. You got some great quotes there. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Bill Burke of the Optimism Institute and the Blue Sky podcast. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Bill Burke. He founded the Optimism Institute in 2022 after an extensive media and sports career. He's been an executive, a writer, a producer at the Weather Channel, at Turner Warner Broadcasting, at Turner Classic Movies, at TBS Superstation. But I got to ask you, you were the chairman of the Portland Sea Dogs, an affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. You really got into sports too.
Yeah. And, I've been very lucky in just about every way one could be lucky. And in this case, my late father, when he was retiring also from the media business, he loved baseball. And we spent every summer in the beautiful state of Maine, not too far from where you are. And his dream was to bring minor league baseball to Maine. So in 1994, he founded the Portland Sea Dogs, double A affiliate at the time of the Florida Marlins. We later switched to the Red Sox. I wound up living in Maine for other reasons. And when my father's health declined, he had dementia, I sort of moved in from behind the scenes and took over management of the club. And then before he passed, we named me chairman. So it literally fell in my lap. And my sister and I were the co-owners, and it was so much fun. And we were there when the Red Sox won 4 World Series, and the minor league owners actually get World Series rings. So I have a couple of my dad's and some of our own, and it was just so much fun. And minor league baseball, if your listeners have ever been, it's so much fun because it's much more accessible, way more family friendly. And you get to see these guys on the way up. So a lot of these superstars, ultimately with the Red Sox and been traded around in other teams, they all come up through these leagues. So you get to know them as youngsters. You try to guess who's going to make it and who isn't. And we love the game of baseball. And we wound up selling the team last year. Major leagues have taken over the minors and made a lot of changes, have made it a little bit tougher to be an owner. But we kept our seats, and my mom still goes to games, and I was at a bunch this summer, and we'll never shake a love for baseball. So it was just a very fortunate, lucky thing for me, and I had a terrific experience and a lot of fun.
You have really quite the interesting career, as we talked about, graduating from Harvard Business School in 1992, and then 30 years of impressive corporate career, but also really some interesting experiences. Writing books and running baseball teams and things like that. What's the secret to your success?
It's a good question. I don't know. I have to lead with luck and good fortune. Raised by great parents, had every opportunity growing up. But then with that, I think it's hard work. I'm a big believer in humility, in giving other people credit. They usually deserve it and they don't get enough. Surrounding yourself with people who are better at what they do than you could ever be, and delegating aggressively. I think that a lot of executives try to do too much, try to second guess too much. I think the best thing you can do is surround yourself with great people and let them do their job. The baseball team's a great example. My title was chairman, and that was probably pretty accurate because I didn't have an office at the ballpark. We had this incredible front office. I had 2 different presidents under my watch. One retired and was replaced by a fantastic successor. And I let him do his job. And he would come to me when he had a tough challenge or a problem or a question. We'd look at budgets and that sort of thing. But I think just letting people do their job is huge. And humility and kindness, it sounds trite. It's kind of basic. But I left the Weather Channel. I resigned from there. And I got a lot of letters and emails and that sort of thing. And I'll never forget, there's a guy, I didn't even know who it was, who hand wrote a letter that said, "I'll always remember how you always said hi to me in the cafeteria." I was the CEO of the company. And I thought to myself, what else would I do? But people's benchmarks are so low for people in executive positions. And frankly, a lot of people in those positions abuse them or just get aloof. And so I think that's a lot of it, is just trying to stay grounded and down to earth and treating people well and working hard.
So Bill, a lot of CEOs wouldn't be described as humble. They might be described as egotistical. A lot of CEOs wouldn't be described as people that delegate. They'd be described as micromanagers. A lot of CEOs wouldn't be described as kind. They'd be described as tough. They wouldn't be described as people that say hi. They'd be too busy to stop to say
Right.
hi. So,
Right.
On everything you've said, a lot of CEOs, the typical CEO, the reputation of the CEO would be very different. So why are you so different? Where'd you learn this from? And do you think that your route is right, or is the sort of the typical, standard route, the more typical CEO?
Well, I'll start with where I learned it. And my formative experiences were with my dad, who ran a major media company. His brother, my uncle, was the CEO of Johnson & Johnson during the Tylenol crisis, actually. So I got to see him in action, literally on television and that sort of thing. And they were those kind of people, down to earth, humble, kind. I think too, I'll push back a little bit because I think it's sort of like our perception of the world based on the news. I think you hear about the nasty CEOs, they're portrayed in film, they are profiled in magazines. The ones, it's sort of like airplanes. You don't hear about the safe landings. You hear about the crashes. I think there are a lot more great, good people in leadership positions in business than are given credit. And their very humility is the reason they're not on the front page or in the papers. And the fact that they're not getting in trouble and not causing scandal is why you don't read about them. So I'd push back a little bit on that. I think there are far more great, humble, good business leaders than we hear about. I don't know if it's the majority, the plurality. I don't know how you define it, but I think it's underreported, put it that way.
I hope you're right. But that's certainly not sort of the reputation that a lot of CEOs have. And I hope that some people listen to your comments about humility, about delegation, about kindness, and about stopping to say hi. I got to ask you about another podcast that you did that I found kind of interesting. You were talking about how 97% of the problems on Reddit came from 1% of the people.
It kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. I think that things just get an outsized impact on us because they get blown up. So, and I'm assuming the newspapers in Toronto, if you go on the websites, they have comment sections. And in our country, you go into the comment section and it could be an article on baseball. I'm making it up. And someone will say, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I love the Red Sox. Oh, I hate the Red Sox. Oh, you probably voted for Trump. No, and all of a sudden it devolves into this horrible thing. And if you read that, you'd think, oh my gosh, the world's going to hell on a handbasket. But if you ever pay attention to the handles of the people writing, it's like 12 people who are just going back and forth. But if you read that, you think it's more representative. So that statistic, 1% of the people on Reddit are causing 90% of the kerfuffle, if you will. That to me encapsulates it. And it's a trap we can fall in when we go online and we just read about the crashes and the wildfires, and there are terrible things happening in this world. But nobody reports on, here's a forest that didn't burn this week, or here's a country that hasn't gone to war in 100 years, or here I am at LaGuardia Airport where 1,000 planes landed safely today. That's not newsworthy. And so we don't hear about it.
How are you going to get this message out? You've got your podcast. Do you think it's going to reach people?
It's reaching people now. I'd like it to grow, and it is growing. I hope it gets bigger. I think some bigger name guests, and I have a feeling I'm going to pick up some Canadian fans. I sure hope so, from being on a great show like yours. We'll see. I'm optimistic about that. I also would like to get off of, in addition to the podcast, do some real world stuff like corporate events. I've talked to CEOs who say that employee morale, as it's always been a challenge, but it's a particular challenge now because so much of the low morale is coming from outside the workplace. So people are coming in with all this baggage about politics, about climate change. And if there's a way to help their employees feel better about the world outside of work, there'd be a more efficient, better company to work at and to run. So I think there are opportunities for me to do more public speaking, more conferences and that sort of thing. And who knows, maybe some more traditional media like this interview, or some shows here in the United States where I might be able to have weekly spots or that sort of thing. We'll see. It's very early still. I've been doing the podcast for 6 months and I'm learning a lot, and I'm really enjoying it. So I'm committed to this, and it'll be fun to see where it goes.
I have somewhat of a similar career and experience to you, not nearly as illustrious, but I did also graduate from Harvard Business School, and I did work in sports. I was the CFO, you were the chairman, so a little bit different. I've worked in a couple of other jobs, never as the CEO, always as the CFO or COO or something like that. And I wanted to go back to school as well after a long career, and I wanted to understand where economic development and entrepreneurship came from. And I had always been a finance guy, and thought it was all about sort of the finance and the money and the capital, and making sure that people did the economic analyses right. So I went back and did my doctorate in business. I didn't finish it. It's still in process, but did a bunch of the courses. And through that, I came to the conclusion that it was all about social capital, and social capital, not in sort of the money capital sense, but social capital in terms of relationships with people.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily optimism, but it is the empathy that I think you interviewed Nita Novak about. It is
Yes.
the kindness that you just talked about. It is the delegation. It's the working with people, and I've struggled on how to sort of get that message out. I had a speech that I did on the 10 powers of co, which were 10 different words of description of how to work well together. Maybe I'd be a candidate for your Optimism podcast.
There you go.
But you know, it's interesting that people get motivated, don't they, by certain passions, whether it's my social capital passion or your optimism passion. And a lot of people, I talked to a guy yesterday who said it was interesting. We talked. He's an author of 6 books. He's a high school gym teacher, but he became an author of 6 books. And I asked him, how? And he said, you had to change the attitude of you're not ready to publish and become a millionaire. You're writing for yourself. And if you write for yourself and you're happy about it, the chances of it being interesting and getting published go up and are far better.
Yes.
And so I think that your attitude of, having an impact on optimism and my desire to have an impact on people having better interpersonal relationships, both, in their personal life as well as in their business life, I think that's great. Whether we end up achieving worldwide success or whether we just influence a couple of people. And I think that I congratulate you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And I congratulate you. And I think you're right. I think that gym teacher's right. You write for yourself. And if you're doing work that you're personally passionate about, it's going to be authentic. You're not putting on an act. It's true to what makes you tick. And when it comes to social capital versus, money capital, I interviewed Charles Kenny, who's worked for the Center for Global Development. He said, we get global development wrong, economic development, when we focus just on metrics like GDP and not on quality of life. And so there are countries with GDPs that couldn't compare to the United States or Canada, but where the people are a lot happier depending on the metrics that you use. And we should think more about that than just these raw financial statistics, which at the end of the day don't make people happier. And there's tons of research that says that of all the things people care about in their job, compensation isn't often even in the top 5. It's, am I treated with respect? Do I produce a product I care about? Do I feel good about where I work? Am I proud to hand people my business card? It's not all about the money. And I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Well, I like your 4 things about being humble, delegating, kindness, and saying hello. I can't tell you how many people walk into an office and don't bother to say hello. I've become a real fan of this this Apple TV series, Ted Lasso.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you've seen it. The football coach that goes to London to become a soccer coach. And the best line, I think, in his whole show is when he takes Jamie, I can't remember his last name, the star soccer player aside and says, buddy, you are 1 in a million. You're the best soccer player I've ever coached. You're 1 in a million, and you're 1 in a million. The problem is you don't also realize that you're 1 of 11. And until you realize that you're 1 out of 11, you're never going to be the success that you could be.
Yeah.
And I think that's key. You got to realize that you're part of a team, and saying hello is the minimum of what you should be doing to create those relationships with people. Anyway, we got to take a final break for some messages, and we're going to be back in 2 minutes with Bill Burke of the Optimism Institute, the Blue Sky podcast, for some concluding comments. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Bill Burke, who is the head of the Optimism Institute. He laughs because he's the only person at the Optimism Institute, but he's the head of the Optimism Institute. And he's got a podcast called the Blue Sky Podcast that's out every week, once a week. And what he's trying to do is to motivate us all and to educate us all about people that are optimistic and trying to positively change the world. And I think it's a wonderful objective and passion that he's got. But Bill, I got to ask you, how do you do it? Some people, they meditate in the morning. Other people think that, I read a gratitude journal. Other people write down what they want to do on a sign and put it on the wall, like Ted Lasso did with Believe. Other people got to listen to inspirational podcasts. Other people got to read the book, The Secret. Other people are just, trying to, be happy all the time. Then a lot of people take drugs and drink and do other things to get happy. What's your secret? What's your recipe? What's your recipe for people on how to create an optimistic attitude toward life?
Well, it's a great question. It's a tough question. I mean, I can share. I do have a handful of the things you mentioned, not the drugs part, but meditation, gratitude. I think gratitude is huge. We haven't talked much about that, but in our worst circumstances, there's always something to be grateful for, and I think reminding ourselves of that is really important. And I think some of it is, we tend to blame others, and we blame the media, and we blame social media fairly in a lot of cases, but we play a role too. So we can put our phones down. We can stop following that person online that is driving us crazy. We can stop for a second and say, well, geez, maybe that person does have a point. Maybe I shouldn't lash out so much. So a lot of it, I think, is just training ourselves to realize that we have agency. We have things that we can do. I finally figured out, I can't remember which social media platform it was, but I was like, why do I keep hearing these nasty things from this person? Then I realized a friend of mine followed them. So because my friend followed them, they were in with me. And I finally had to decide I was going to just stop following my friend because he was bringing all this baggage with him. You just don't need it. You got to pull yourself out from that. I call it blue sky. I mentioned it before, but this meditation prompt that there's always blue sky up there, but sometimes you have to get your head above the clouds to see it. And if you just sit back and let yourself be bombarded, I mean, and at least in the United States, cable news is really unhealthy. It just feeds us with so much divisiveness and so much negativity. We have to take some responsibility. People talk about social media hygiene. We brush our teeth every day, and we, take care of ourselves in those ways. And we really need to think about our media consumption in the same way as well, I think. So that helps me, and to always be looking at the positive side of a story when you hear the negatives.
I'll give you my three. See what you think of it. So I think that, one of the things that is really important to have is empathy for other people. And one of the best ways to be empathetic, because we can't go out and meet everybody, is to read fiction. Because if you read fiction, you disappear for half an hour, an hour, or a week, or whenever it is, you do it into someone else's life and what's going on. And I find that, in my business career, I read way too much nonfiction, way too many newspapers, way too many facts and figures. But to actually read a story, and, you can probably do it with a TV show or a movie or something like that as well. But actually written fiction, where you actually disappear into that book, and that book is so engrossing that you don't want to put it down. You don't want to finish it because you want it to go on for a long time. I think that's number one, because by living someone else's life via fiction, you will truly develop empathy. So that's number one. Number two is you do something active outside. I think there's something special about activity, and we all have heard about fitness and health and all that kind of stuff. But I think just going to the gym, isn't what you really need. You need to do it outside, whether it's forest bathing or going for a swim or going for a walk or whatever. But there's something about being outside in nature,
no doubt,
that is critical. And then the last one, I think, is gratitude. And you mentioned it, and lots of people mention it. And whether it's praying, or whether it's meditating, or whether it's having a gratitude journal, or whether it's over dinner telling someone what were the three things that happened, however you do it, it doesn't really matter. But somehow recognizing that something good was happening. And you know what I'm going to say tonight before I go to bed, Bill, is because I pray every night. But it's not a religious prayer. It is sort of a religious prayer, but it's more of a gratitude meditation than anything. I'm going to say thank you for meeting you, because you've motivated me to be more empathetic, to be humble, to be kind, to delegate, and to say hi to everyone when I walk through the office tomorrow. So thank you for joining us and sharing some of your insight. Tell us again, what's the name of the website, and what's the name of the podcast, and how can we get it?
So it's a mouthful. It's the optimisminstitute.com, and the podcast is Blue Sky. And you can find that anywhere you get your podcasts. It's also listed on the website. You can scroll through past episodes. You can do that in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you name it. And, one of the fun things is I interview a wide range of people. So there's probably going to be at least a couple on there that have sparked your interest. And I'd be honored if you gave it a listen and give me your feedback. And I really appreciated this time with you, Brian, to tell my story and to reach some of your listeners in the great country of Canada, not too far north of where I am today.
Bill Burke, thank you so much for joining us tonight. That's our show for tonight. I remind everybody I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. in the Toronto area. But you can stream me online, even from New York or even from Atlanta or where it is that you are, Bill, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts are available on Apple, Audible, Speakeasy, SoundCloud, etc. All my videos are available on social media. I put them up on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And all of that stuff is available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Bill Burke, thank you so much.
Thank you.